Sarah and Mike had been planning this trip for months, and as their Subaru rumbled down Highway 1 toward Big Sur that Friday afternoon, the stress of their demanding jobs in San Francisco finally began to melt away. They were both in their early 30s, exhausted by the relentless grind of city life, and this hiking trip into the Santa Lucia Mountains was supposed to be their reset button, their chance to reconnect with each other and with something real and wild. In the back seat, Cooper, their 4-year-old German shepherd, had his head out the window, ears flapping the wind, tongue lolling with pure joy, and seeing him so happy made Sarah smile for the first time in what felt like weeks. They arrived at the trailhead just after 3 in the afternoon, the parking area nearly empty, and as they shouldered their packs and checked their gear, Mike kissed Sarah's forehead and said, "No phones, no emails, no problems, just us in the mountains," and she had laughed and agreed, both of them silencing their phones and tucking them away. The trail began in coastal redwoods, cool and fragrant, but within the first mile they climbed into brilliant sunshine that painted the slopes gold and green. Cooper ranged ahead on his leash, tail wagging constantly, and Sarah found herself genuinely relaxed for the first time in months. The views were spectacular. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly west, while ridge after ridge of wild mountains rolled away to the east. They saw no one else on the trail, which was exactly what they'd wanted. The solitude felt like a gift, the silence broken only by bird song and the whisper of wind through the dry grass. After about 3 hours of steady climbing, they reached the clearing Mike had marked on his map, a flat area nestled among oak trees with a seasonal creek nearby that still held water despite the dry California summer. "Perfect," Sarah said, dropping her pack with a grateful sigh. And they set about making camp with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this many times before. Mike pitched their tent while Sarah organized their food and hung the bear bag, and Cooper explored every inch of their campsite, marking his territory and satisfying his curiosity. They worked well together, barely needing to speak, each knowing what needed to be done, and within an hour they had a proper camp established. Tent secured, sleeping bags rolled out, their small camp stove set up for cooking, water filtered from the creek. The sun was getting lower now, maybe an hour from setting, and the quality of light was changing in that magical way that only happens in wild places, everything taking on a golden glow that seemed almost unreal. Sarah sat on a fallen log and pulled out their planned dinner ingredients, while Mike gathered some dead wood for a small campfire, and for a few perfect minutes, everything felt exactly right with the world. That's when Sarah first saw it. She had been looking west, admiring the way the setting sun painted the ridgeline across the canyon, when movement caught her eye. Except it wasn't really movement, more like the sudden appearance of something that hadn't been there a moment before. On the distant ridge, perhaps half a mile away, stood a figure. Even from that distance, Sarah could tell it was impossibly tall, maybe 8 or 9 feet if she had to guess, and it was completely black, a silhouette so dark it seemed to absorb the golden light around it rather than reflect it. The figure wore what looked like a wide-brimmed hat, the kind you might see in old westerns, and it held something in one hand that could have been a walking stick or staff. It stood perfectly still, facing in their direction. "Mike," Sarah called, trying to keep her voice steady. "Do you see that?" Mike straightened up from where he'd been arranging kindling and followed her pointing finger. She watched his expression change from curious to confused to unsettled. "Is that a person?" he asked, squinting against the light. "It has to be, right? Maybe another hiker or a ranger." But even as he said it, neither of them believed it, because something about the figure felt fundamentally wrong in a way that made Sarah's skin crawl. Mike dug into his pack and pulled out his binoculars, raising them to his eyes and adjusting the focus. "I'm going to get a better look at—" He stopped mid-sentence, lowering the binoculars with a jerk, his face gone pale. What is it?" Sarah demanded. "It's gone. The second I looked through these, it just vanished. It was there. I saw it clearly for maybe half a second, and then it was just gone like it was never there at all." Sarah took the binoculars from him and looked for herself, scanning the ridge where the figure had been standing. Nothing, just empty ridgeline, rocks and scrub brush, and the darkening sky beyond. She lowered the binoculars and looked with her naked eyes. Still nothing. "That's crazy," she said, trying to laugh it off even though her heart was beating faster than it should. It was probably just a shadow or a weird rock formation that looked like a person in this light. The sun does strange things at this time of day. "Yeah," Mike agreed, but he didn't sound convinced. Yeah, probably just a trick of the light. They tried to return to their camp tasks, but the easy comfort of a few minutes ago had evaporated. Sarah found herself glancing repeatedly at that ridge, half expecting to see the figure again, while Mike built the fire with uncharacteristic fumbling, having to restart it twice. Cooper had stopped his explorations and was sitting at the edge of camp, staring intently in the direction of the ridge, his ears forward and alert in a way that made Sarah's unease grow. "Cooper, come here, boy," she called, but the dog didn't respond, which was unusual. He was normally very obedient. As the sun sank lower and the sky began to deepen from gold to orange to purple, Sarah saw a movement on a different ridge, this one to the north of their camp. Another figure, just as tall, just as impossibly black, wearing the same wide-brimmed hat and holding what looked like a walking stick. This one was closer, maybe a quarter-mile away, and like the first, it stood completely motionless, facing toward their camp. "Mike," she said quietly, and he turned to look where she was pointing. "Jesus Christ," he breathed. They both stared at the second figure, neither reaching for the binoculars this time, somehow knowing that looking too closely would make it disappear again. The figure didn't move, didn't shift, didn't do anything except stand there against the darkening sky, like a paper cutout placed against a painted backdrop. "We should leave," Sarah said, her voice shaking slightly. "Right now. We should pack up and hike out while there's still some light." "And go where?" Mike asked reasonably, though she could hear the fear in his voice too. "It's getting dark fast, and the trail is rough. We could break an ankle, or worse, trying to hike out in the dark. Besides, it's probably... it has to be something normal, right? Maybe they're rangers or scientists studying something, or..." He trailed off, unable to come up with a convincing explanation. Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to insist they leave, but she knew he was right about the danger of hiking the trail in darkness. They had headlamps, but the trail had some tricky sections with steep drop-offs that would be genuinely dangerous to navigate without daylight. "First light," she said firmly. "The absolute second there's enough light to see the trail, we're packing up and getting out of here." "Deal," Mike agreed immediately. They made dinner in tense silence, both of them jumping at every small sound, every rustle of wind in the oak leaves above them. The figures remained on their respective ridges as the last light faded, and then, as full darkness settled over the mountains like a heavy blanket, Sarah could no longer see them at all. But somehow that was worse, because now she didn't know if they were still there or if they'd moved, and the thought of them moving close in the darkness made her stomach clench with fear. Cooper finally came to them, but wouldn't eat his dinner, instead lying between them with his body tense and his head up, alert in a way Sarah had never seen from their normally relaxed dog. They tried to eat their freeze-dried meals, but neither had much appetite, and they gave up halfway through, sealing the food and hanging it properly despite their distraction. Mike fed the fire, making it larger than was probably wise, both of them seeking comfort in the light and heat it provided. Full darkness had fallen now, the kind of complete blackness that only exists in wild places far from any human lights, and above them the stars were beginning to emerge in their thousands, so bright and numerous they would have been beautiful under different circumstances. That's when the sounds began. At first it was just footsteps, the unmistakable crunch of feet on dry leaves and twigs, circling their camp just beyond the reach of firelight. Sarah grabbed Mike's arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to hurt, and they both froze, listening. The footsteps continued, steady and deliberate, moving in a circle around them at a consistent distance of maybe 30 or 40 feet. "Hello," Mike called out, his voice cracking slightly. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped immediately, and in the sudden silence, Sarah's heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her throat. Then, after a pause that stretched for at least 10 seconds, the footsteps resumed, but now they were joined by another sound. Branches snapping in a rhythm that was too regular to be natural. Crack, 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 pause. Crack, 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 pause. Over and over again from different directions around their camp. "We need to get in the tent," Sarah whispered, and Mike nodded, neither of them taking their eyes off the darkness beyond the fire. They called Cooper and retreated to their tent, zipping it closed with shaking hands, and Mike positioned their brightest flashlight, so it lit up the interior. Outside, the sounds continued and multiplied. The circling footsteps, the rhythmic branch snapping, and now a low humming or droning sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, a deep vibration that Sarah could feel in her chest as much as hear. Cooper pressed himself between them, his body rigid, a continuous low growl rumbling from his throat as he stared at the tent entrance with his hackles raised. The sounds continued for hours, never stopping, never changing in pattern, and Sarah and Mike held each other in the darkness, both too terrified to sleep despite their exhaustion. Sometimes the footsteps would come very close to the tent, close enough that Sarah was certain whatever was making them could reach out and touch the fabric if it wanted to. And during those moments, she had to bite her lip to keep from screaming. The humming sound rose and felt like breathing, and occasionally Sarah thought she heard something that might have been words in a language she didn't recognize, though that could have been her exhausted mind creating patterns from random noise. Mike dozed fitfully, jerking awake every few minutes with a gasp, while Sarah couldn't sleep at all, her eyes wide in the darkness, every nerve in her body screaming at her to run, even though she knew they couldn't. Not in this darkness. Not with those things out there. The sounds continued until just before dawn, and then, as the first gray light began to seep into the sky, they stopped all at once, as suddenly as if someone had flipped a switch, leaving only the normal sounds of wind and birds and the creek in the distance. And in that sudden normalcy, Sarah finally closed her eyes and fell into an exhausted, dreamless sleep. Sarah woke to pale dawn light filtering through the tent fabric and Mike's hand gently shaking her shoulder, and for a blissful moment she couldn't remember why her body felt so heavy with dread until the memories of the previous night came flooding back. The figures on the ridges, the circling footsteps, the inhuman sounds that surrounded their camp for hours. She sat up quickly, her heart already racing, and saw that Mike looked haggard, dark circles under his eyes, his normally calm demeanor replaced by something tight and anxious. "We need to talk about what happened," he said quietly, and Cooper, who was curled between them, lifted his head with a low whine. They emerged from the tent into morning sunshine that should have been comforting, but somehow felt wrong, like the world was wearing a mask of normalcy over something fundamentally broken. Their campsite looked exactly as they left it. The fire reduced to cold ashes, their cooking gear still neatly arranged, the bear bag hanging undisturbed from the oak tree. But the atmosphere felt different, charged with a tension that made Sarah's skin prickle. She scanned the ridgelines, half expecting to see those tall silhouettes standing in the daylight, but there was nothing, just empty slopes and sky. Did that really happen? Sarah asked, her voice hoarse from lack of sleep. Or did we both just, I don't know, have some kind of shared panic attack or something? Mike shook his head slowly, and she could see he'd been wrestling with the same question. I don't know. I mean, it had to be real, right? We both saw the same things, heard the same things. Cooper reacted to it. They both looked at their dog, who was sniffing around the perimeter of camp, his body language cautious, pausing every few steps to look out into the forest with his ears alert. Maybe it was other hikers, Mike continued, but even as he said it, his voice lacked conviction. Maybe they were messing with us, or they were drunk or high, or... Hikers don't disappear when you look at them through binoculars, Sarah said flatly. And hikers don't make sounds like what we heard last night. They stood in silence for a moment, and then Sarah made a decision. We're leaving. Right now. We pack up and we hike out. But Mike was looking at his watch, then up at the sun. It's barely 6:30. We didn't sleep. We're exhausted. If we try to hike out now, running on adrenaline and no rest, one of us is going to trip and break something, or we'll make bad decisions. He paused, and Sarah could see him trying to convince himself as much as her. It's a 6-hour hike back to the car. That means we get there around noon, maybe 1 o'clock, in the full heat of the day, completely wiped out. Or we could rest a day, stay alert, and leave first thing tomorrow morning when we're not so exhausted and the trail is safer. Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to insist they leave immediately, but she was exhausted. Her legs felt like lead, and she knew he was right about the danger of hiking in their current state. We stay together, she said finally. We don't split up, not for a second. And tomorrow at first light, we're gone. Agreed, Mike said, and she could see the relief in his face that she wasn't going to fight him on staying. They tried to fall back into their camping routine, making breakfast on a camp stove, boiling water for coffee, but everything felt forced and mechanical. The coffee tasted like ash in Sarah's mouth, and she noticed Mike kept glancing at the ridgelines, his jaw tight. Cooper wouldn't eat his breakfast at all, which was unprecedented. The dog normally inhaled his food with enthusiasm, and he stayed close to them, his usual playful energy completely absent. After breakfast, they decided to take a short day hike to explore the area, partly because sitting around camp would drive him crazy with nervous energy, and partly because they needed to convince themselves that everything was normal, that last night had been some kind of aberration. We'll just do the loop trail, Mike said, studying his map. 3 miles. Takes us up to that overlook and back. We'll be back by noon. Plenty of time to rest before tonight. Sarah noticed he said tonight, like it was inevitable, like they were definitely staying another night. And part of her wanted to object, but the other part was too tired to fight. They packed light day packs with water, snacks, and their first aid kit, and set out with Cooper on his leash, leaving their camp behind. The trail was beautiful in the morning light, winding through oak woodland and patches of chaparral, with occasional views of the ocean glittering in the distance, but Sarah couldn't enjoy it the way she normally would. She kept looking over her shoulder, kept scanning the ridges, kept waiting for something to happen. Cooper was reluctant from the start, dragging behind him instead of pulling ahead like he usually did, and several times he stopped completely, forcing them to coax him forward. About a mile into the hike, the strange occurrences began. At first it was subtle, rocks rolling down the slope to their right. Small ones at first, then larger, bouncing and clattering down the hill when there was nothing visible to dislodge them. Probably just settling, Mike said, but his voice was uncertain. Or a lizard or something running around up there. But then it happened on their left side, too, and then ahead of them, rocks tumbling across the trail as if invisible hands were pushing them, and Sarah felt her breath coming faster, her heart starting to pound. The trees around them began to creak and sway despite the fact that there was no wind, the air completely still and hot, and Sarah watched in growing horror as an entire oak tree bent and straightened, like something was pushing on it, though nothing was there. "Mike," she said, grabbing his arm, "we need to go back." "Yeah." He agreed immediately, and they turned around, walking faster now. But Cooper suddenly stopped dead in his tracks about 20 feet ahead of them, the leash going taut. The dog's hackles rose in a ridge along his spine, and he started barking. Not his normal alert bark, but something frantic and terrified, barking at empty air in the middle of the trail. "Cooper, come," Sarah called. But the dog backed away from whatever he was seeing, still barking, his eyes fixed on a point of the trail that looked completely empty to Sarah. Mike moved toward him, and Sarah shouted, "No, don't go near there." She didn't know why she said it. Didn't know what instinct made her grab Mike's shirt and pull him back, but the feeling of wrongness radiating from that spot on the trail was so intense it made her nauseous. They backed away slowly, Cooper finally breaking his fixation and scrambling backward toward them. And they took a different route back to camp, bushwhacking through the chaparral, getting scratched by branches and slipping on loose rocks, but none of them want to go back down that trail past whatever Cooper had seen. The hike back to camp should have taken 30 minutes, but felt like hours, and the whole way Sarah felt like they were being paced, like something was moving through the trees parallel to their path. She would catch movement in her peripheral vision, a dark shape sliding between tree trunks, always at the edge of her vision, always vanishing when she turned to look directly. Branches snapped in the forest around them with sharp cracks that made her jump, and she could hear footsteps, heavy and deliberate, matching their pace, though she couldn't see what was making them. Mike heard it too. She could tell by the way his jaw was clenched, by how tightly he gripped his hiking pole like a weapon. Cooper was whining continuously now, looking in all directions, his body pressed against Sarah's legs. When they finally stumbled back into their campsite, Sarah felt a rush of relief that immediately curdled into fresh unease. They'd only been gone maybe 90 minutes, but something felt different about their camp. "Did you move your boots?" Mike asked, and Sarah looked down at where her hiking boots sat near the tent. She was certain she left them side by side, toes pointing toward the tent entrance, but now they were several feet apart, one pointing east, one pointing west. "No," she said slowly. "Did you move the water bottle?" He shook his head. The water bottle that had been sitting on the log near their stove was now on the opposite side of camp, balanced on a rock. "Wind," Sarah suggested weakly, but they both knew there had been no wind. They did a careful inventory of their camp, and several other small items had been moved. Mike's hat was no longer hanging on the tree branch where he'd left it, but was now on top of their cooler. Sarah's sunglasses had been relocated from the tent pocket to the ground near the fire pit. Nothing was damaged or missing, just moved, like something had been going through their things while they were gone, examining them, rearranging them. "Okay," Mike said, and Sarah could hear how hard he was working to keep his voice steady. "Okay, this is... maybe an animal got into camp. A raccoon or a bear or something, just moving stuff around." "In broad daylight?" Sarah asked, "when we weren't even gone that long. And nothing's disturbed except for things being moved very specifically." She could hear the edge of hysteria creeping into her voice and tried to control it. "I don't know what to tell you, Sarah," Mike snapped, and she realized he was just as scared as she was, maybe more so, because he was trying so hard to find rational explanations that kept slipping away. "I don't know what's happening. I don't know what those things were last night. I don't know why Cooper freaked out on the trail. I don't know who or what moved our stuff. I just know that we made a decision to wait until morning, and I think we should stick with that decision, because I'm too tired and too scared to make the hike out right now." His voice had risen almost a shout, and Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, but she nodded. He was right. They were both exhausted and rattled, and trying to hike out now, in this state, would be dangerous. They spent the rest of the afternoon trying to rest, but both were too on edge to actually sleep. Sarah lay in the tent with her eyes closed, trying to calm her racing thoughts, but every sound made her eyes snap open. Was that footsteps? Was that breathing? Mike sat outside the tent, ostensibly reading a book, but actually spending more time staring at the ridgelines than at the pages. Cooper paced constantly, moving from Sarah to Mike and back again, whining softly, refusing to settle. The shadows grew longer as the sun tracked across the sky, and Sarah watched them with growing dread, knowing that twilight was coming, knowing that when those purple shadows filled the canyon, the watchers would return. The afternoon stretched out endlessly, each minute feeling like an hour, and Sarah found herself both wanting the sun to stay up forever and wanting to set quickly just to get the night over with. Mike came into the tent around 4 o'clock and lay down next to her, and they held hands without speaking, both of them staring at the tent ceiling, both of them wondering what fresh horrors the coming night would bring, both of them knowing somehow that whatever happened tonight will be worse than the night before, that whatever was out there in those mountains was not done with them yet. And the worst part was not knowing what it wanted, not knowing if they would survive to see another dawn, not knowing if they had made a terrible, fatal mistake by deciding to stay at BY late afternoon. The dread had become almost unbearable, sitting on Sarah's chest like a physical weight that made it hard to breathe. And when she and Mike finally emerged from the tent around 5 o'clock, neither of them could pretend anymore that everything would be okay. The sun was still above the ridgeline, but sinking fast. Maybe an hour of daylight left. And they both knew they had a decision to make right now. Pack up and hike out in the remaining light, or commit to staying through another night. "We should go," Sarah said, her voice flat and certain. "Right now. We grab our packs, we leave the tent if we have to, and we just go." Mike was looking at the sky, calculating. It's 5 o'clock. We got maybe an hour of full light, then another 30 minutes of twilight, before completely dark. The trail takes 6 hours in good conditions, and we're exhausted and scared. So figure 7 or 8 hours. That means we'd be hiking in complete darkness for at least 5 or 6 hours, maybe more if we're slow. He turned to look at her, and she could see the fear in his eyes warring with logic. "Sarah, I want to leave too. God, I want to leave so badly. But that trail has some really dangerous sections. Those switchbacks with the drop-offs, the creek crossing that scree field. In the dark, exhausted, panicking. We could really hurt ourselves. Or worse. And staying here is safe?" Sarah shot back, gesturing at their camp. "After everything that happened? After last night? I'm not saying it's safe," Mike said, his voice rising with frustration. "I'm saying we have to choose between two dangerous options, and I think trying to hike out in the dark is more likely to kill us than staying here for one more night." They argued for another 10 minutes, precious daylight bleeding away while they went in circles. But ultimately Sarah knew he was right, knew that stumbling through those mountains in pitch darkness with whatever was out there would be suicide. And the bitter irony was that the very thing they were afraid of had forced them into this position where their best option was to stay and face it. "First light," she said again, the words almost a mantra now. "I don't care how tired we are. I don't care about anything. First light, we leave." "First light," Mike agreed, and they both knew they were making a pact to survive the night ahead. They spent the next 30 minutes preparing their camp with the intensity of soldiers preparing for battle, both of them moving with grim determination. Mike reinforced the tent stakes, driving them deeper into the ground, while Sarah organized their gear, putting everything they would need for a quick escape into their packs: phones, GPS, water, headlamps with fresh batteries, their warmest layers. Cooper paced around them constantly, whining, his anxiety feeding their own. Mike gathered every piece of firewood he could find, building a pile that would last all night, saying, "If nothing else, we'll have light." And Sarah didn't argue, even though she suspected light wouldn't save them from whatever was coming. She found their hiking poles and the small folding knife they used for cutting cord, arranging them within easy reach of the tent. Weapons that would probably be useless, but made her feel slightly less helpless. The sun touched the western ridge, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she turned to look at the eastern ridge where they'd first seen the figure the night before. For a moment there was nothing, just a darkening slope and the sky beyond, and she felt a flicker of hope that maybe tonight would be different. Maybe whatever had been watching them had moved on. Then it appeared. One moment the ridge was empty, and the next moment it was there. The impossibly tall silhouette, the wide-brimmed hat, the walking stick held in one hand, standing perfectly motionless against the sky. Sarah grabbed Mike's arm hard enough to leave bruises, and he turned to look, his face going pale. "Same place as last night," he said quietly. They watched the figure for a few seconds, neither of them breathing, and then Mike said, "There's another one, North Ridge." Sarah turned and saw the second watcher, just as tall, just as still, standing on the ridge to their north. Her stomach dropped. "Mike," she whispered, "look behind us." He turned slowly, and they both saw the third figure standing on the ridge behind their camp, the one that rose to the east. 3 watchers, on 3 different ridges, forming a triangle around their campsite with them at the center. "We're surrounded," Sarah said, and heard the edge of panic in her voice. Mike pulled out his phone, hand shaking, and opened the camera app. "I'm going to get proof. I'm going to photograph them. And then at least we'll know we're not crazy." He raised the phone, aimed it at the nearest watcher, and tapped the screen to take a picture. Then he lowered the phone and looked at the photo, and Sarah watched the color drain from his face. What is it?" She grabbed the phone from him and looked at the image. It showed the ridge perfectly, every rock and bush visible in the fading light. But where the tall figure was standing, there was nothing, just empty ridge. "That's impossible," Sarah said. "We can see it right there." She looked up from the phone to the ridge. The watcher was still there, clear as day, then back down at the photo, which showed nothing. Mike took the phone back and tried again, taking 3 more photos in rapid succession. But when they reviewed them, all 3 showed empty ridges, no figures at all. "They don't want to be documented," Mike said, his voice hollow. "Or they can't be. Maybe they're not really there. Maybe we're both hallucinating." "Cooper sees them too," Sarah pointed out, and they both looked at their dog, who was staring fixedly at the watcher on the north ridge, his hackles raised, a low growl rumbling from his throat. "So either they're real or all 3 of us are having the same psychotic break." The sun sank lower, and Sarah watched in horror as the 3 watchers remained perfectly still, all of them facing toward the camp. And she had the overwhelming sense that they were waiting for something, waiting for full darkness. "We need to decide right now," Sarah said. "We can still make a run for it. We grab our packs. We run for the trail. We take our chances in the dark." Mike looked at the 3 figures, then at the fading light, then at the trail that led down into the canyon already deep in shadow. "If we run now, we'll be running toward one of them. They're on all sides of us. And in about 10 minutes, it'll be dark enough that we won't be able to see the trail, and we'll be alone in the forest with those things." He was right, and Sarah knew it, but accepting it made her want to scream. They'd waited too long, debated too long, and now they were trapped. "Fire," she said. "Make the fire as big as we can, get all our lights ready, and we hold out until morning." They worked quickly as the last light faded, Mike coaxing the fire to life and feeding it until it was a substantial blaze, while Sarah set up their brightest lantern inside the tent and arranged their headlamps and flashlights where they could reach them instantly. She also filled their water bottles and put energy bars in easy reach, preparing for a siege. Cooper refused to leave their sides, pressing against their legs, and when Sarah tried to give him dinner, he wouldn't even look at it, his entire attention focused on the darkening ridges. The sun slipped below the horizon, and twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances. The 3 watchers remained visible for a few more minutes, dark silhouettes against a luminous sky, and then as full darkness fell like a curtain, they vanished, or became invisible. Sarah couldn't tell which, and wasn't sure it mattered. "Into the tent," Mike said, and they retreated to their nylon shelter, zipping it closed, Cooper squeezing in between them. Mike positioned one flashlight pointing at the entrance and another at the back of the tent, creating pools of light that somehow made the shadows between them seem darker and more ominous. They sat there in silence, waiting, and Sarah counted her heartbeats, wondering how long they had before it started. The answer was, not long at all. Within 5 minutes of full darkness, the sounds began, and they were immediately worse than the previous night. Footsteps came from all directions, not just circling the camp, but crisscrossing it, dozens of feet moving through their campsite, heavy steps that shook the ground slightly with each impact. Sarah could hear them walking past the tent, sometimes so close that she was certain if she reached out she could touch whatever was making them through the thin fabric. The scraping started soon after, something dragging along the outside of the tent, moving from the bottom to the top and back down again, a rasping sound that made Sarah's teeth ache. Mike grabbed her hand and squeezed so hard it hurt, both of them frozen, barely breathing. Then came the whispers. At first they were too quiet to make out, just a sibilant hissing from multiple directions. But they grew louder, and Sarah realized with dawning horror that they were forming words. Not in English, not in any language she recognized, but there was definitely structure to them, rhythm and inflection that suggested meaning. The voices sounded wrong, too deep and too hollow, like wind blowing through caves or across empty bottles, and they seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding the tent. Cooper started barking, sharp, explosive barks that hurt Sarah's ears in the confined space. His first standing on end, his eyes wild with fear. "Cooper, quiet," Mike hissed, but the dog couldn't stop, barking at the tent entrance, at the walls, at the shadows that seemed to move independently of their light sources. Something walked past the tent, something so heavy that Sarah felt the ground vibrate, felt the tent stakes shift, and she heard a sound like breathing, deep, rattling inhalations and exhalations that didn't sound like they came from human lungs. "Oh, God," Mike whispered. "Oh, God. Oh, God." And Sarah realized he was praying or just repeating the words like a mantra against the terror. The tent stakes began to pull up one by one. Sarah heard each one pop free from the ground with a small sucking sound, felt the tent fabric go slack as its anchors were removed from the earth. "They're taking down the tent," she said, her voice high and thin with panic. "Mike, they're taking down the tent with us in it." But before Mike could respond, before they could decide what to do or how to react, Sarah saw something that made her mind rebel against accepting what her eyes were showing her. On the tent wall, cast by their flashlight beam, was a shadow, the shadow of a figure standing just outside the tent. But their flashlight was inside the tent, pointing at the wall from the inside, which meant there should be no shadow, no figure silhouetted between the light source and the fabric. The shadow was impossibly tall, impossibly thin, with a distinctive shape of a wide-brimmed hat and a long staff or walking stick. And as Sarah watched in frozen horror, it moved, tilting its head as if examining them, as if it could see right through the tent fabric and was studying like insects in a jar. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling the tent with their alien syllables, and Sarah could hear them forming almost words now, phrases that her brain tried desperately to parse into meaning, even though some deep instinct told her that understanding them would be dangerous, that these were sounds human minds weren't meant to comprehend, sounds that predated language as she knew it. Mike was gripping her hands so tightly that her fingers were going numb, both of them staring at the impossible shadow on the tent wall, watching it tilt its head back and forth as if studying them from different angles. And Sarah realized with a jolt of pure terror that there were more shadows now, multiple tall figures surrounding the tent, their silhouettes overlapping and separating on the fabric walls, moving in ways that defied the physics of how shadows should behave. Cooper had gone from barking to a continuous howl, a sound of primal fear that Sarah had never heard from before, and the dog was shaking so violently that she could feel the tremors through the floor of the tent. The footsteps intensified, no longer just walking but running, dozens of feet pounding the ground around their tent in a circle, faster and faster, creating a rhythm that was almost hypnotic, and Sarah found herself swaying slightly, her consciousness starting to blur at the edges. "Stay with me," Mike said urgently, shaking her shoulder. "Sarah, stay focused, don't listen to it." But it was hard not to listen when the sound was everywhere, when it was inside her head, when the running footsteps and the whispers and Cooper's howling were blending together into a symphony of madness that threatened to pull her under. Then everything stopped. The footsteps, the whispers, the scraping sounds, all of it ceased simultaneously. leaving only Cooper's whimpering and her own ragged breathing. And the silence was somehow more terrifying than the noise had been, because now they didn't know what was happening, couldn't track the threats by sound. Sarah strained her ears, listening desperately for any indication of where the watchers were or what they were doing. But there was nothing, just an oppressive quiet that pressed down on them like a physical weight. "Maybe they're gone," Mike whispered. But Sarah could hear the desperate hope in his voice, the need to believe it was over even though they both knew it wasn't. Then came the single set of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, heavy enough to shake the ground with each step, approaching the tent from the direction of their dying campfire. Step, pause. Step, pause. Each footfall measured and purposeful, getting closer, and Sarah could feel her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might burst. The footsteps stopped directly outside the tent entrance, close enough that if Sarah reached out she could touch whatever was standing there through the thin nylon barrier, and she found herself holding her breath, every muscle in her body locked rigid with fear. For a long moment there was nothing, just the awareness of a presence outside the tent, and then Sarah heard it breathing. It didn't sound like human breathing, didn't have the right rhythm or quality. It sounded like wind moving through a deep cave, or air being forced through some vast bellows, a deep resonant sound that Sarah could feel in her chest as much as hear. In and out, steady and patient. And with each exhalation, she could swear she felt the tent fabric move slightly, as if whatever was out there was so close that its breath was disturbing the tent wall. Cooper suddenly went completely silent, and when Sarah looked down at him, she saw that the dog was staring at the tent entrance with his eyes wide, his whole body trembling, his lips pulled back from his teeth in a silent snarl of terror. The breathing continued for what felt like hours, but was probably a minute or two, and then something scratched along the tent zipper from the outside. It was a slow, dragging sound, whatever was doing it tracing the zipper from bottom to top, then back down again, as if testing it, learning how it worked, and Sarah had a horrifying vision of the tent unzipping from the outside, of whatever was out there reaching in for them. "Get away from us!" Mike suddenly shouted, his voice cracking with fear and anger. "Leave us alone. Get the fuck away." The scratching stopped immediately, and for a heartbeat Sarah thought it had worked, thought that confronting it had driven it away. But then the footsteps resumed, heavier now, angrier somehow, moving around the tent in a tight circle, and they were joined by other footsteps, multiple sets, surrounding them completely. The temperature inside the tent suddenly plummeted. Sarah could see her breath misting in the beam of the flashlight, could feel the cold seeping through her sleeping bag and clothes, a bone-deep chill that had nothing to do with the normal temperature of a mountain night. Frost was forming on the inside of the tent fabric, spreading in crystalline patterns that sparkled in their lights, and Sarah's fingers and toes were going numb despite the thick socks and layers she was wearing. "This isn't natural," Mike said through chattering teeth. "This is wrong. This is all wrong." A smell hit them then, seeping into the tent from outside through every gap and seam, and Sarah gagged as it filled her nose and mouth, coating her tongue and throat. It was a smell of ancient earth, of things that had been buried for centuries and should have stayed buried, of decay and rot and fungal growth, and something else underneath it all, something fundamentally wrong that her mind couldn't categorize because it was outside her experience, outside the normal spectrum of smells that existed in the natural world, something that made her hindbrain scream warnings about danger and wrongness. Cooper began to claw at the back of the tent, his nails ripping at the fabric, desperate to escape, and Sarah grabbed him, but he was too strong, too frantic, and she couldn't hold him. Their phones, which had been sitting next to their packs charging from portable batteries, suddenly lit up simultaneously, the screens glowing with an eerie blue-white light that cast strange shadows inside the tent. Sarah grabbed hers with shaking hands and looked at the screen, and her blood went cold, ice forming in her veins. Instead of her normal home screen with its familiar apps and photos, the display showed symbols, geometric patterns that hurt to look at, shapes that seemed to shift and rearrange themselves as she watched, forming configurations that her eyes could see but her brain couldn't process. And as she stared at them, she felt a wave of nausea and disorientation wash over her, making the tent spin around her. Mike's phone was showing the same thing, the same impossible symbols. And when he tried to turn it off, pressing and holding the power button, nothing happened. "The GPS," Sarah said, releasing Cooper and fumbling for the GPS unit in her pack. She turned it on and waited for it to acquire satellites. And when the map finally appeared, she felt her stomach drop. According to the GPS, they weren't in the Santa Lucia Mountains anymore. They were somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, thousands of feet underwater. She watched in disbelief as their position jumped and changed, showing them in Death Valley, then in Oregon, then somewhere in Mexico, the coordinates flickering and changing faster than should be possible. "It's not working," she said, her voice hollow. "None of our navigation is working. We can't. If we run, we won't know which way to go." "We can't stay here," Mike said, and Sarah could hear the edge of panic in his voice. "Sarah, we can't stay here. Whatever this is, whatever they are, they're not going to stop. They're going to keep escalating until—" He didn't finish the sentence, didn't say what they were both thinking, that the Watchers were going to kill them or drive them insane, or do something worse that they couldn't even imagine. The tent stakes were being pulled up again, one after another, pop, 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 and the tent was starting to sag and lean as it lost its structural support. Something grabbed the tent fabric from outside and pulled hard, and Sarah heard the sound of nylon tearing. "We have to go now," Mike shouted over the sound of ripping fabric, and Cooper's renewed howling. "Pack the emergency stuff. Just grab what we need and run." They moved with frantic speed, working by muscle memory and adrenaline, shoving items into their packs with shaking hands. Phones, useless, but they grabbed them anyway. GPS, malfunctioning, but it was all they had. Water bottles. Headlamps with fresh batteries. The flashlights. A few energy bars grabbed and shoved into pockets. Their warmest jackets pulled on with fumbling fingers. Cooper's leash clipped to his collar while he thrashed and fought. Everything else, sleeping bags, tent, most of their gear, their camp stove and food, abandoned, left behind. No time to pack it, no room in their packs even if they had time. Mike grabbed their hiking poles, thrust one at Sarah, and she took it knowing it was useless as a weapon, but needing to hold something solid in her hands. The tent was coming down around them, the walls collapsing inward, and Sarah could see dark shapes moving outside, silhouettes passing in front of their campfire, impossibly tall and impossibly thin. "The fire," Mike said. "We need to put out the fire before we leave. Can't leave it burning. Could start a forest fire." Even now, even in the middle of terror and chaos, the responsible part of his brain was working, and Sarah loved him for it even as she wanted to scream at him that it didn't matter, that they needed to run now. But she knew he was right. They burst out of the collapsing tent together. Cooper lunging ahead of them on the leash, nearly pulling Sarah off her feet, and the night air hit them like a slap. Their headlamps cut weak beams through the darkness, illuminating the campsite in fragments. The dying fire, the scattered gear, the tent fabric now fully collapsed and tangled. But beyond the reach of their lights was absolute darkness, a blackness so complete it seemed solid. Sarah couldn't see the Watchers, but she could feel them, could sense them standing just beyond the light, watching, waiting. Mike ran to the fire and began kicking dirt over it, stamping out the flames, moving fast but methodically, and Sarah stood guard with her hiking pole raised uselessly, turning in circles, trying to watch all directions at once. Cooper was going insane on the leash, barking and lunging toward the forest, toward the trail that led down and out, every instinct telling him to run. The fire went dark, the last ember extinguished, and for a moment their headlamps were the only light in the entire world. Two small beams cutting through an ocean of darkness. "Go!" Mike shouted, and they burst into motion, Sarah releasing the death grip she'd had on her fear and letting it transform into fuel, into the adrenaline that flooded her system and made her legs pump, made her run faster than she'd ever run before. Cooper led the way, pulling so hard on the leash that Sarah had to hold it with both hands. The hiking pole forgotten and dropped, and they crashed into the forest, heading for where they knew the trail began, their headlamps bouncing wildly, illuminating trees and rocks and shadows that might have been natural or might have been something else. Behind them, they heard sounds, their tent being torn apart, gear being scattered and destroyed, and underneath it all, a sound that might have been laughter or might have been the wind. Sarah couldn't tell and didn't want to know. The forest was pitch black beyond their headlamps, a darkness so complete it felt like running through a void, and the only proof the world still existed was the ground under their feet and the trees that loomed suddenly from the blackness. Cooper was pulling so hard on the leash that Sarah's arm felt like it was being yanked from its socket, the dog running in blind panic, and she held on with both hands, because losing him now would mean losing him forever. Mike was right beside her. She could hear his ragged breathing and the crunch of his footsteps, but she couldn't see him even though he was less than 3 feet away. Both their headlamps pointed forward, tunneling through the darkness but illuminating so little. Behind them, the sounds of their camp being destroyed continued, fabric ripping, poles snapping, gear being thrown and scattered, and Sarah could hear other sounds too, sounds that made her run faster even though her lungs were already burning. Heavy footsteps, multiple sets of them, deliberate and purposeful, not running but walking, and yet somehow keeping pace with their frantic sprint. She risked a glance over her shoulder and immediately wished she hadn't. There were shapes moving in the darkness behind them, tall silhouettes just at the edge of where her headlamp beam faded to nothing, and they were following, maintaining a consistent distance of maybe 50 feet, walking with those long, impossible strides that covered ground faster than should be possible. "Don't look back." Mike gasped. "Just run, Sarah. Just keep running." She focused forward again, following Cooper, trying to remember the trail even though everything looked different in the dark, distorted and unfamiliar. They should have been on the main trail by now. Should have found a clear path they'd hiked up just 2 days ago. But instead, they were crashing through underbrush, scrambling over rocks, ducking under low branches that appeared suddenly in their headlamp beams. The GPS in Mike's hand was still malfunctioning, the screen showing their position jumping erratically, but he was trying to use it anyway, try to find some pattern in the chaos that would point them toward the trailhead. "This way," he shouted, veering left, and Sarah followed blindly, trusting him because she had no better option, no other plan except run and keep running until they reached safety or until whatever was chasing them caught up. The trail, if it was even the trail, seemed to go on forever, stretching impossibly longer than it had been on their hike in, and Sarah's sense of time was warping, stretching, and compressing, so that she couldn't tell if they'd been running for minutes or hours. Her watch said they'd left camp 15 minutes ago, but it felt like they'd been running through this nightmare forest for days. And when she checked her watch again, only 30 seconds had passed. And then she checked again, and it said 3 hours, the numbers meaningless and shifting. The footsteps behind them never stopped, never faltered, always maintaining that same distance. And Sarah could hear other sounds now, too, branches breaking the forest on either side of the trail, heavy bodies moving through the trees parallel to their path, pacing them. Whatever was following them wasn't alone. There were multiple watchers, moving through the forest in coordination, surrounding them, hurting them. "Mike," Sarah panted, her lungs screaming for air. "They're on both sides of us." "I know," he said, and she could hear the desperation in his voice. "I know, but we can't stop. We have to keep going. We have to get to the car." Their headlamps began to flicker despite having fresh batteries, the beams dimming and brightening in a rhythm that didn't match their footfalls, and in the moments when the lights dimmed, Sarah could see things in the darkness, or thought she could, shapes moving between the trees, tall and thin and wrong, keeping pace with them, and she couldn't tell if they were really there or her exhausted, terrified mind was creating them from shadows and fear. A tree fell across their path with a tremendous crash. No warning. No sound of it cracking or breaking beforehand. Just suddenly they're in front of them, and they had to scramble over it, Cooper whining and struggling, all of them losing precious seconds while the footsteps behind them grew closer. Sarah heard something that might have been breathing, that wind-through-cave sound, coming from multiple directions, surrounding them in a circle of wrongness. The whispers started again, carried on the wind, or maybe not on any wind at all, maybe just emanating from the darkness itself, those alien syllables that hurt to hear, that made Sarah's head throb and her vision swim. She could hear her name in the whispers now, or thought she could, Sa'ara, Sa'ara, stretched out and distorted, and then Mike's name too, Mike, as if whatever was following them was learning their names, claiming them, marking them as prey. Don't listen, Mike shouted, and Sarah realized she'd been slowing down, had been turning toward the whispers, drawn by some horrible fascination. Sarah, don't listen to them, just run. She forced herself to focus on Cooper's back, on the rhythmic motion of the dog running ahead of her, used that as an anchor to keep herself moving forward, to resist the pull of those whispers that promised, if she just stopped, if she just turned around and looked, everything would make sense. Everything would be explained. Movement in the trees to their right. Something massive crashing through the underbrush, and Sarah caught a glimpse in her headlamp beam of something impossibly tall moving between the trunks, its shape wrong in ways her brain couldn't process, too thin and too tall, and moving with joints that bent in directions that violated the rules of anatomy. Cooper yelped in terror, stumbling, and Sarah almost fell over him but caught herself, yanking him forward, both of them running faster now, adrenaline overriding exhaustion. Mike's headlamp cut a wild arc through the darkness as he looked behind them, and Sarah heard him make a sound like a sob or a scream, something raw and primal, and he grabbed her arm and pulled, both of them running faster than they'd ever run before. "They're closer," he gasped. "Sarah, they're getting closer. We need to—" He didn't finish the sentence because at that moment Sarah saw them too, had glanced back and seen the watchers, dozens of them now, tall silhouettes moving through the forest in perfect silence, walking with those measured, deliberate steps, and they were less than 30 feet behind now, and Sarah could see details in her headlamp beam, the wide-brimmed hats, the walking sticks, the impossible height, and worst of all, where their faces should have. Then there was nothing, just smooth darkness, no features, no humanity, nothing but void. She screamed and ran, her body finding reserves of energy she didn't know she had, Mike matching her pace stride for stride, Cooper pulling them forward with the strength of panic. The trail. And she was sure now they were on the actual trail because she recognized the particular rock formation they'd passed on the way up, dipped and curved, switchbacking down the mountainside, and they took the turns too fast, sliding on loose gravel, nearly falling but somehow staying upright through momentum and desperation. Sarah's ankle turned on a rock, and pain shot up her leg, but she didn't stop, couldn't stop, just limped forward as fast as she could until the pain faded into the general agony of her protesting muscles and burning lungs. The sound behind them were different now. Still those footsteps, still that rhythmic walking, but faster, the watchers accelerating, and Sarah heard something new, a sound like wind rushing through a tunnel, building in volume. And she realized with horror that the watchers were no longer just walking but were somehow moving faster without running, gliding or sliding or teleporting. She couldn't tell which, just knew that they were closing the distance with impossible speed. "Mike!" she screamed, but he was already running as fast as he could, his breathing harsh and ragged, and she knew he heard it too, knew he understood they were about to be caught. Then she heard something else, her own voice calling from the darkness to her left, saying, "Mike, over here, this way," perfectly mimicking her voice, and she heard Mike's voice from the right saying, "Sarah, I found a trail," but Mike was right next to her running, and those voices were coming from the darkness, from the watchers or from the forest itself, trying to separate them, trying to lead them astray. "Don't listen," Sarah shouted, That's not us. That's not real. They passed the spot where they'd stopped for lunch on their hike in. Sarah recognized the fallen log, and that meant they were maybe halfway back, maybe 3 miles still to go, and she didn't know if they could make it, didn't know if their bodies could sustain this pace for another 3 miles, didn't know if the watchers would let them get that far. Her vision was starting to tunnel, black spots appearing at the edges, and she shook her head violently, trying to clear it, knowing that if she passed out now she was dead. The GPS in Mike's hand suddenly beeped, and he looked down at it, and Sarah saw his face change in a headlamp light, saw hope and confusion war across his features. "It's working," he gasped. "Sarah, it's showing the trail. It's showing the parking lot. According to this, we should be almost there. It says we're only half a mile from the trailhead." But that was impossible. They couldn't have covered 5.5 miles already. They'd only been running 4. Sarah looked at her watch and couldn't make sense of what she was seeing. The numbers spinning and changing. 10:47 p.m. No wait to 23 a.m. No 11:15 p.m. Time itself warping and breaking down around them. "It doesn't matter," she shouted. "Real or not. If it says the parking lot is close, then we run toward where it says to go." Mike nodded and adjusted their course slightly based on the GPS. And they ran on, Cooper still pulling them forward, the dog's endurance superhuman. Or maybe he was just as terrified as they were, and fear was fueling him the same way it was fueling them. The forest seemed to be changing around them, the trees growing denser and then suddenly sparse, the ground rising and falling in ways that didn't match Sarah's memory of the trail, and she had a horrible thought that they weren't running to the normal forest anymore, that they'd somehow crossed into somewhere else, somewhere that looked like the Santa Lucia Mountains but wasn't, somewhere the watchers had more power, more control. The footsteps behind them were so close now that Sarah could feel the vibration of them through the ground, could hear the sound of walking sticks striking rock with sharp cracks, and she was certain that if she looked back she'd see them right behind her, close enough to touch, those impossibly tall figures with their void faces reaching out with long arms to grab her. She didn't look back. She kept her eyes forward and ran, legs pumping mechanically, lungs burning, heart hammering so hard she could feel in her throat, in her temples, in her fingertips. Mike stumbled and almost went down, catching himself at the last second, and Sarah grabbed his arm, helping him stay upright, and they kept running. The whispers were all around them now, a cacophony of alien voices speaking in that language that predated humanity, and Sarah could hear her name and Mike's name woven through it all, could hear Cooper's name too, Cooper, and the dog whined and pulled harder, nearly dragging her off her feet. Then, impossibly, Sarah saw a light ahead through the trees, not the wan beam of their headlamps, but real light, steady and bright, and for a moment she thought they'd made it, thought they'd reached the parking lot, but as they got closer she realized it was moonlight. The moon had risen and was now illuminating the forest with silver glow, and she could see the trail clearly now, could see it winding down ahead of them, could see, and her heart nearly stopped. The trailhead in the distance, maybe a quarter mile away, the parking lot visible as a lighter patch in the darkness, and there, gleaming in the moonlight, was their car. The sight of their car gave Sarah a burst of energy she didn't know she still had, and she ran faster, Mike beside her, Cooper pulling them forward with renewed desperation. The parking area was maybe 200 yards away, their Subaru visible in the moonlight, looking impossibly normal and beautiful. Behind them, the footsteps accelerated, massive bodies crashing through the forest on both sides, trying to cut them off before they reached the parking lot. Something huge burst from the trees to their left, and Sarah screamed and veered right, nearly colliding with Mike, both of them stumbling but staying upright. 100 yards. The trail opened up, trees thinning. 75 yards. The sound behind them were deafening. Footsteps pounding, branches snapping, that wind-through caves breathing surrounding them. 50 yards. Cooper barking frantically, pulling with every ounce of strength. 30 yards. Sarah could see their camping gear in the back seat, coffee cups and holders. details of normal life. 20 yards and Cooper broke free, the leash slipping from Sarah's hands, and the dog sprinted and threw himself against the car door, howling. 15 yards and Sarah heard something right behind her, felt the air move as something massive passed within inches of her back, felt a presence so overwhelming and wrong that her skin crawled. And she couldn't look, just ran with everything she had left. 10 yards and she could hear breathing directly behind her, could smell that ancient earth smell, could feel the presence of something impossibly tall reaching for her with arms that were too long. 5 yards and her foot hit pavement, and she nearly fell, but Mike grabbed her and they reached the car, and Sarah fumbled for the keys with shaking hands, and they slipped and clattered on the pavement. No, 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 she sobbed, dropping to her knees, searching frantically while Cooper barked, and then her fingers closed around the key ring, and she stood and jabbed the key fob button, and nothing happened, battery dead or broken. Manual key, Mike shouted, and Sarah's shaking fingers found the physical key on the ring, and she jammed it into the driver's door lock, and turned, and the lock clicked open, and she yanked the door wide, and threw herself into the driver's seat, while Mike ran around to the passenger side, and Cooper leaped into the back seat through Sarah's open door. Sarah hit the lock button as Mike got his door open, and he dove in and slammed it shut and locked it, and for a moment they just sat there, gasping for breath, their headlamps still on, illuminating the interior of the car in wild dancing beams as their heads shook with exhaustion and terror. Then Sarah looked through the windshield toward the tree line, and her breath caught in her throat. They were emerging from the forest. The watchers, dozens of them, impossibly tall figures stepping from between the trees into moonlight. They were even more wrong than she'd imagined. Each one 9 or 10 feet tall, impossibly thin with limbs too long and jointed in too many places. They wore wide-brimmed hats that cast their faces into shadow, and each carried a long walking stick, moving with a strange gliding gait, completely silent despite their size. Drive, Mike screamed, and Sarah jammed the key into the ignition with shaking hands, turned it, and the engine caught immediately. The most beautiful sound she'd ever heard, the dashboard lights coming on, the familiar hum of the motor. She threw the car into reverse without bother with her seatbelt and stomped on the gas, the Subaru lurching backward, tires squealing, and she spun the wheel, turning the car around in a wild arc that nearly sent them into the ditch. The watchers were maybe 20 feet from the car now, still advancing in that silent glide, and Sarah shifted into drive and floored it, the car shooting forward down the dirt road that led away from the trailhead, gravel spraying from the tires. She checked the rear-view mirror and saw them standing at the edge of the parking area, a line of tall, dark figures watching them leave, and even as she watched they began to fade, becoming translucent, then transparent, then gone, as if they'd never been there at all. Sarah drove like a maniac down the winding dirt road, taking turns too fast, the car sliding and fishtailing, but she couldn't slow down, not until they hit the paved highway, and even then she kept her foot pressed hard on the gas, putting mile after mile between them and those mountains. Mike was staring straight ahead, his hands gripping the dashboard, his breathing harsh and ragged, and in the back seat Cooper had finally stopped barking and was lying down, his sides heaving with exhaustion. Nobody spoke for almost an hour, the only sound the hum of the engine and the whispered tires on pavement, and Sarah drove north on Highway 1, the ocean invisible in the darkness to their left, the mountains looming to their right, and she didn't slow down until she saw the lights of a town ahead, the first signs of human civilization, of safety. She pulled into an all-night diner, one of those roadside places that cater to truckers and late-night travelers, and the fluorescent light spilling from its windows looked like the most beautiful thing Sarah had ever seen. She parked and turned off the engine, and for a long moment they just sat there, 3 exhausted, traumatized creatures in a car, not quite able to believe they'd made it out, not quite able to process what had just happened to them. Finally Mike spoke, his voice hoarse and broken. "Did that really happen?" Sarah looked at her hands, saw the rope burns on her palms from Cooper's leash, saw the scratches on her arms from branches, felt the ache in every muscle of her body, and nodded. Yeah, it happened. They went into the diner, Cooper on his leash, and the waitress took one look at them, wild-eyed, scratched and dirty, still wearing their hiking clothes, and didn't ask any questions, just brought them coffee and water and menus. Sarah ordered breakfast even though she wasn't hungry, just needed something normal, something routine, and when the food came she forced herself to eat, each bite an act of returning to the normal world. Mike pulled out his phone, and now that they were away from those mountains, it was working normally again. No strange symbols, no glitching, just his regular home screen, and he typed, "Dark Watchers, Santa Lucia Mountains," into the search bar. He read for a few minutes, his face getting paler, and then turned the phone so Sarah could see. There were dozens of accounts, going back centuries, of tall, dark figures seen on the ridges of the Santa Lucia Mountains at twilight, always wearing wide-brimmed hats, always carrying walking sticks, always disappearing when approached or observed directly. The Spanish explorers had reported them. The Chumash people had legends about them, and modern hikers continued to see them, though most reports were dismissed as shadows or tricks of the light. But there were other stories, too, stories of people who'd encountered them at night, who'd heard the sounds and the whispers, and Sarah noticed that many of those stories didn't have endings or ended with people being found days later, incoherent and traumatized, unable or unwilling to explain what had happened to them. "We're not the first," Mike said quietly, "and we won't be the last." Sarah nodded, thinking about all the people who might have hiked into those mountains and never come back, all the missing persons cases that were filed away as accidents or people who'd gotten lost, and she wondered how many of them had actually encountered the Watchers and hadn't been as lucky as she and Mike and Cooper. They made a silent agreement, there in that diner, not to talk about this to anyone who wasn't there, not to try to convince anyone of what they'd experienced. Because who would believe them? They had no proof. The photos hadn't worked, their GPS logs were corrupted, and even if they tried to explain, people would think they'd had some kind of shared psychotic break, or had gotten into bad mushrooms, or were making it up for attention. Some things, they realized, had to be carried alone, held close and private, known only to those who'd lived through them. They drove home as the sun rose, the mountains to the east turning gold and then blue in the early morning light, and Sarah kept her eyes on the road ahead, refusing to look at the ridges, refusing to scan them for tall, dark silhouettes, even though part of her wanted to. Part of her needed to know if the Watchers were still there, still watching. Cooper slept in the back seat, exhausted beyond measure, and Sarah was grateful for that, grateful that at least the dog could rest even if she couldn't. When they finally pulled into their driveway in San Francisco, it was almost noon, and their apartment had never looked so good, so safe, so wonderfully normal and mundane. They brought their packs inside but left most of the gear in the car, neither of them willing to deal with it yet. And Sarah realized with a start that they'd left their tent and sleeping bags and most of their camping equipment up there in those mountains, abandoned at their campsite. "You think it's still there?" she asked Mike, and he knew immediately what she meant. "I don't know," he said. "I don't know if it's still there, or if it ever was there, or if the Watchers took it, or if it just disappeared." "We could go back," Sarah said, though even as she said it, she knew she wouldn't. Knew she would never set foot in those mountains again as long as she lived. "We could go back and get our stuff." Mike looked at her and shook his head. "No, we couldn't. We won't. Some things should stay lost." And Sarah knew he was right, knew that their tent and gear and everything they left behind was gone, either literally destroyed or simply inaccessible, because there was no force on earth that could make her return to that clearing, to those ridges, to those mountains where the Watchers stood. The weeks that followed were hard. Neither of them slept well, both plagued by nightmares of tall figures and alien whispers. And sometimes Sarah would wake in the middle of the night, convinced she could hear footsteps circling her bed, convinced she could smell that ancient earth smell, but it was never real. just echoes of trauma that would probably never fully fade. Cooper bounced back faster than they did, his canine resilience letting him return to his normal happy self within days. And Sarah was grateful for that, grateful that at least their dog hadn't been permanently marked by what they'd experienced. And sometimes, on clear evenings when the sun was setting and the world was painted in shades of purple and gold, Sarah would look toward the hills or mountains or even just the ridgeline of buildings in the distance, and she would see them, or think she saw them. She could never be quite sure. Tall, dark silhouettes standing on high places, watching, waiting, patient and eternal. And she would turn away quickly and go inside and lock the door and tell herself it was just her imagination, just shadows, just a lingering trauma of what she'd experienced. But deep down she knew the truth, knew that the watchers were still out there, still standing on their ridges at twilight, still waiting for the next person to wander too far into their mountains. And there was nothing anyone could do about it, because some things existed outside human understanding, outside human control, older than civilization, and patient enough to wait forever,